So moving on, the biology of human development. So we're going to talk briefly about biology of human development after birth. So let's talk about reflexes in babies. Newborn humans have reflexes which help them navigate the new world around them before they develop the skills to process their environment cognitively. So there's not a lot of cognitive processing going on in newborns. So they need a way to, keep them keep them alive and help them navigate their environment. And these primitive reflexes are the way that they accomplish that. So I just put some of the more common reflexes that you may see up here. It's not super necessary that you know all of them by heart, but you should be able to identify them and you should be familiar with them when you see them on the MCAT. So the Moro reflex is the first one. And that entails the baby being startled at loud sounds. So when the baby hears loud sounds or quick motions, it will extend its arms and legs out, cry, and it will extend its limbs back in. So some of these are kind of funny to conceptualize, and if you want to, they're actually kind of interesting. And you can find videos online of babies doing this. It's actually really interesting. Some of the ways that they check for neurological defects in adults is to see if some of these reflexes are present, because these reflexes are supposed to disappear pretty soon after other skills are developed in babies. So within the first couple of years, most of these reflexes, or actually all of these reflexes, should be gone. So if they're present in adults, that usually indicates some sort of neurological disorder. And the same is true for the opposite. If these are absent in children and babies, infants, where it should be present, that can also indicate some sort of neurological upset. Yes, absolutely. The Babinski reflex is definitely the most common one that I've seen. Babinski, rooting, and I want to say palmar grasp are probably the three most common that I see. So rooting reflex, the baby, upon being touched on the cheek, will turn its head in the direction that it was touched to open its mouth to breastfeed. Pretty straightforward. The sucking reflex, again, sort of goes hand in hand with the rooting reflex. It just allows the baby to eat without, having a conscious effort to take in food. The baby will begin sucking when something touches the roof of its mouth. So, when the baby starts to breastfeed and the nipple touches its mouth, it's going to start breastfeeding. The Babinski reflex is when the sole of the foot is stroked, the baby will fan its toes out and curl its big toe upward. So this specifically is one that I've seen on the MCAT where they use to indicate in adults neurological defects. If the Babinski reflex is present in adults, then that usually indicates that. So yeah, like Janelle said, that's one that I would be familiar with. The tonic neck reflex, when the baby's head is turned to one side, the arm on that side will extend out and the opposite arm will bend up at the elbow. So this is probably the one that was like the most difficult to actually, conceptualize. So the picture at the top of the cute little baby over there is actually demonstrating the tonic neck reflex. So you can see the baby is looking to the right. That arm is extended out and the other one is, bent up at the elbow. The palmar grasp reflex, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, the baby will grasp in response to something stroking its hand. So if you've ever seen a newborn waving its hand and you put your finger right there, he's going to squeeze it. That's the palmar grasp reflex. And the stepping reflex, also known as the walking reflex, is when a baby's foot touches a flat surface, they will attempt to put the other foot in front to walk. So this reflex is present in newborns. And it, strangely enough, is present in newborns. It disappears around 6 weeks, and then it reappears again around 10 to 12 months when the baby starts to learn to walk. So it reappears just in time, and it helps the baby actually learn to walk before they can, cognitively understand what they're doing. But like I said, this is definitely something you should be familiar with. It's a good thing to review, and it's a good thing to understand why babies exhibit reflexes. And maybe a couple of them you should know a little bit more in detail. So we're going to talk a little bit more about motor development in children. So the first year of a human's life is dominated by reflexive movements, as we just talked about. So those are the primitive movements that they're innate. We're born with them, and before we can process things, in our mind, they help us navigate the environment. They help us survive. So the first voluntary movements performed by babies are referred to as rudimentary movements. So these are rolling, crawling, sitting up, any sort of locomotion or movement of limbs that you can think of that babies do. These are the rudimentary movements, and it coincides with the reflexive movements. Rudimentary movements are usually exhibited between birth to about 2 years old. So yeah, it's the same. It's in the same time frame as reflexive movements. These two sort of overlap. Fundamental movements are the next types of movements that are developed. So they're usually developed from ages 2 to 7. These are more coordinated activities, not too complex, but you need a little bit more advanced brain functioning to coordinate these movements. So like running, jumping, throwing, and these usually develop as children engage in more physical and social play. So these children are growing up. They enter, 3, 4, 5. They start to go to school. They might even join organized sports. So that's how they develop these fundamental movements. At about age 7, they enter the stage of specialized movement, and this occurs from about ages 7 to 14. So in this stage, we're basically just building on fundamental movements. These movements are going to be combined, and we're going to execute complex movements. So when you think about sports, usually sports for really young children, the rules are simplified, the mechanics are simplified. So as you start to get older, these sort of, the rules become a little bit more similar to what you would see for an adult game. And maybe, the actual movements that the children are performing are going to become a little bit more complex and a little bit more coordinated. So at this point, a developing child is also more readily able to apply the skill and strategy to these movements. So if they're playing a sport, they'll be able to use their prior knowledge to apply skill to the movement. So that's also a pretty important aspect of specialized movement, is that sort of top-down component. And then after age 14, from adolescence and on, the next stage they move into is the application of movement stage. And it's basically just building on specialized movement throughout your life. So humans are going to continue to apply these movements and refine them during normal daily and recreational activities. So the older we get, the more our motor skills are refined, the more skill and strategy we acquire to apply to these skills. And that's basically just what that stage means. We're constantly learning and we're constantly refining our skills throughout adulthood. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about brain development from children to adult, very briefly. So a newborn child will have the most neurons at that point than at any other point in their life. However, they will not have many neural networks. So neural networks are developed as children grow and learn, and these neural networks are routes for information processing. So newborn children have a bunch of neurons, but they're not necessarily linked together in a way that's helping them out. So the way we grow and learn is actually, it's a process called long-term potentiation. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So as we learn, we create these neural networks through our brain. And that's really how we learn. That's how we encode in our memory. And that's something that children don't have, but they have the potential for it because they have so many neurons. So that's something that we establish as we grow. So maturation is the sequence by which children grow and develop. The process of maturation is mostly genetic and it's mostly universal. So like when we're developing motor functions, it's almost completely universal when all children do it. They'll begin to crawl, they'll be able to sit up, then they'll finally be able to stand, then they'll be able to walk, then they'll be able to run. So that happens pretty sequentially and pretty universally sequentially throughout, with small exceptions. But there are instances in which environmental factors can have an influence on maturation. So, for example, language acquisition is one that's cited a lot when it comes to environmental factors in maturation. So, if a child is without access to language at an early age, this can, delay their learning. Specifically, deaf children, for example. Deaf children that don't have access to language at an early age, we see significant delays in language and cognitive processing. So deaf children actually process sign language exactly the same way as a hearing child will process an auditory language. It uses the same part of the brain. We can even see deaf children enter the babbling stage just as a child that speaks would. They would actually babble with their hands. So it's super interesting. And I mean, if you're interested in that, it's definitely worth a read or worth a video watch because it really is cool. But it's a really great example of how environmental factors can also influence the sequence of maturation. Humans generally do not remember events before the age of 3 to 3.5. This is referred to as infantile amnesia. This does not mean that infants can't learn and memorize because there's a bunch of evidence. We know that infants are constantly learning, they're constantly absorbing, and they do show the ability to retain memory. It's just that, in the long term, most adults will not be able to recall any information that was learned before the age of 3 or 3.5. And there's a lot of debate about what causes infantile amnesia, if it's actually true. But this is the definition that you should know for the MCAT and should apply in your studies.